Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today's lecture will explore the colourful history of Russian art and its place in the story of Russia as a country and the Russians as a race, as told through its folkloric images and many fables and stories, handed down by word of mouth from generation to generation. The reason for Russia's rich diversity and cultural heritage is simply because of its size. By far the largest country on planet Earth, it covers 1/8 of the Earth's inhabited surface and 17 million square kilometres, bordering Europe in the west, China in the southeast, and coming within 50 miles of Alaska in the northeast. In fact, Stockholm is as close to St. Petersburg as Vladivostok is to Tokyo. It is this huge area, populated by hundreds of nomadic tribes for centuries, that has created Russia's colourful history. All of these separate tribes told their own stories and relayed their history from father to son, each story changing slightly with each generation. In fact, until the Russian Revolution in 1917, only 5% of Russians were literate, so every story you hear of Russian history is verbally handed down with very few written records. It was these diverse tribes who created their own versions of Russian history and folklore. The Slavs, the Alan, the Rus, the Mongols, the Scythians, the Varungarians and many more, all telling stories influenced geographically by their own tribe's history. This is why in Russian folklore we see Vikings and Norse warriors, flying carpets from Persia, turban-wearing sultans, and of course the influence of the Orthodox Church, which has stayed strong throughout the centuries. Russia's long-standing devotion to icons dates back to the formation of what we now regard as the country of Russia. In 988 AD, Vladimir of Kiev, having conquered the Rus and the Bulgars, set about converting the predominantly pagan tribes of Russia to Christianity, and thus the Russian Orthodox Church was born. It was more a political than religious decision. For Russia to be able to trade with the Mediterranean countries, it needed a free passage through the Black Sea and the Bosphorus, so it became part of the Byzantine Orthodox culture and it was allowed free movement of goods and citizens. Thus, Vladimir of Kiev, followed by his sons, spread the word of the Christian Orthodox Church throughout Russia. Every town and village had a church built, a cathedral in every city, all decorated in the style of the Orthodox faith with its devotion to the icon. Icon painters, monks and priests were imported from the four corners of the Byzantine Empire to help spread the word of God. Here we see an image of the inside of the Church of the Spilled Blood in St. Petersburg, site of the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. It is the most magnificent showcase in Russia for iconic art. Taking 23 years to build, and during its history being used as a vegetable store and a morgue during the siege of Leningrad, it is now transformed to its former glory after a renovation taking 4 years longer than the original construction. The icon forms the cornerstone of the Orthodox Church. The word icon comes from the Greek word ikonai, meaning to resemble. Icons were painted either for the adornment of churches, or smaller ones were used for the personal contemplation of the faithful. You will see that all icons are painted two-dimensionally, in strict following of the Orthodox Church, and in particular the second commandment, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image." This basically banned the faithful from worshipping false gods or idols. Had the icons been painted three-dimensionally and humanised, the images would have broken this commandment. The two dimensions for the icon is also a foundation for the faithful. The worshipper becomes the third dimension as he surrenders himself to God during his prayers. Here on the left we see a 14th century icon of St. George killing the dragon by Andrei Rublev, the father of Russian icon painting. On the right we see Raphael's version, which was condemned by the Orthodox Church because it did not conform to the second commandment. One of the Orthodox Church's most revered icons is the Theotokos of Kazan, or Madonna of Kazan as she is now known. Copies of this piece hang in the Kazan Cathedral in Moscow, the International Space Station, and in St. Petersburg, where Peter the Great personally hung the icon in 1710. The original was brought to Russia from Constantinople by Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, but in fact this is just a bad translation from Russian to English. The Russians named him Ivan the Formidable because of his great military victories, and the word formidable was originally translated by the Tartars as terrible during the siege of Astrakhan, and the name stuck. The original icon was lost at some point in the 16th century, and only found after a vision of the Madonna appeared to a 10-year-old girl named Matryoshka, telling her the whereabouts of the icon, buried under a house which had been destroyed by marauding Tartar warriors. Since the discovery, invocation of this icon has been credited with the Russian military victories over the Poles in 1612, the Swedes in 1709, and Napoleon's army in 1812, as well as the final defeat of the Germans after the siege of Leningrad in 1944, during which the icon was loaded onto a plane and flown above both Moscow and St. Petersburg to protect the cities. Neither city was captured by the German army. So, icon painting flourished between the 14th and 18th centuries as new cities were built and new churches needed. Russia's capital was now Moscow, and the Golden Triangle to the north of Russia was the historic home of icon painting. 3 villages in the Golden Triangle, Palek, Holy and Myster, had been producing icons for centuries, the artists leading a devout monastic lifestyle and revered as much by the populace as by the priests and monks themselves. Then, in the early 18th century, this art form took a new direction with the foundation of St. Petersburg in 1703. Peter the Great demanded new cathedrals and churches for his new capital, so icon painters were inundated with work for the new Tsar. In 1703, Peter the Great laid the foundations of modern St. Petersburg, after defeating the Finns in the Great Northern War. Construction of the city started immediately with Peter and Paul Fortress in 1703, quickly followed by many other major buildings, including Peterhof in 1705, destined to be the summer palace. Peter used many different architects, both Russian and foreign, to create his dream Venice of the North. But in the northwest corner of Peterhof, designed by Peter the Great himself, lies the much smaller and more intimate Montplaisir Palace. Peter was so pleased with this finished palace that he used it more than the much more opulent Peterhof, and often entertained guests here. Peter was an avid collector of art, being especially interested in Oriental art, and he used the Montplaisir Palace to house his personal collection of art obtained on his travels. In one room, the Lacquer Hall, Peter wanted to display his Oriental collection. He employed 7 Russian icon painters to decorate the walls in the Oriental style, but using Russian folkloric and religious imagery. Using lacquer imported from China, the icon painters told the stories of Russia along the 94 panels. Many years later, a chance meeting between one of the palace employees and a local manufacturer spawned a whole new art form which still survives virtually unchanged today. One of the lacquer panels had become damaged and the palace needed someone to repair it. A merchant named Peter Korobov owned a lacquer factory just outside of Moscow, where he made sundry items such as trays, storage boxes and tables. But his main business was to make lacquered visors for the Russian military helmets. Korobov was employed to repair the panel, and whilst doing so he marvelled at the artwork on the lacquer and decided to try a whole new line in his production. During the 18th century, the fashion for taking snuff had exploded across Europe and Russia. The middle and upper classes were hooked on this new, very expensive nicotine high. The demand for boxes to store snuff was also growing, and manufacturers in various countries had their own take on the materials used. In Germany and France, silver or silver gilt was the preferred method, whereas in England it was porcelain. The Scandinavians preferred wood, but Peter Korobov decided that in Russia it was going to be lacquered papier-mâché. His factory could already manufacture the boxes, so all he needed was artists to complete the work. He favoured lacquered papier-mâché for several reasons. It was lightweight but very durable, so perfect for carrying in a pocket. Once lacquered, the papier-mâché was not affected by the vast temperature differences between summer and winter in Russia. It wasn't as heavy as silver, nor as fragile as porcelain, and not as porous as wood. Korobov employed icon painters and peasant artists to begin production. Originally, the subject matter was left to the artists. The icon painters would paint icons, the peasant farmers would paint what they knew. Simple peasant life involving drinking tea, working the fields, playing music, or young courtship. It wasn't long, though, before the artists started taking special commissions and producing items for the Romanovs, visiting dignitaries and wealthy Russian merchants, and slowly the business grew. News of this new, profitable business spread across Russia, and soon the historic icon painting villages of Holy, Palek and Myster were employed in the manufacture of the new snuff boxes. These 3 villages stayed true to their icon painting roots and produced mostly 2-dimensional work, whereas Korobov and his son-in-law Peter Ludekin produced 3-dimensional work in their new factory in the village of Fedoskino. Since these early days, the manufacture of these exquisite boxes has not changed. They may be a little larger than a snuff box these days, and you will see them displayed in boutiques and museums and shops all over St. Petersburg, but there is a huge disparity of quality. Still today, only 4 original villages are recognised, but many of the items seen ashore are either faked or very poorly produced. So, to better understand this uniquely Russian art form, we need to study its manufacture. Papier-mâché is simply pressed paper. The paper is derived from the lime tree, prevalent in the forests of the Golden Triangle. Once felled, the logs are cured and dried over 2 years before they are pulped into paper. These sheets of paper are then pressed together for 30 days with the temperature in the baking ovens starting at 0, topping out at over 100 degrees, then back down to 0. This removes all the bubbles and moisture. At this point, the papier-mâché is in the form of workable sheets of card between 2 and 5 millimetres in thickness. It is then given to the village carpenters, who will manufacture the boxes into the desired shape. Some are made in standard sizes as stock, some are specifically to the size requested by the artist. There are various levels of carpentry, from apprentices who produce mass-produced blanks for inexpensive boxes on the Moscow and St. Petersburg markets, to the master carpenters whose work can demand $1,000 plus just for the blanks. The better the artist, the more he or she will pay for the blank. Once the box is complete, the lacquering process begins. Unlike Oriental lacquer, which is derived from the sumac tree, Russian lacquer is shellac, the secretions of the lassifer beetle. This is a much harder, far more expensive alternative to sumac, but it is far more suitable for lacquering the boxes and has been used since the very first box was produced in the Korobov factory. Each box is lacquered up to 30 times with black lacquer on the outside and 30 times with red lacquer on the inside, with a layer of clear lacquer in between, and a final 7 to 10 layers of clear lacquer to finish. With 1 day's drying time between layers, the lacquering process can take upwards of 5 months per box, on top of a month to make the papier-mâché and 2 years drying the wood. Thus, the process to create just the canvas on which the artist will paint can take 2.5 to 3 years. The image on the left here is the lacquer vat in Fedoskino. This is their third vat in over 200 years. This one was installed just before the Russian Revolution of 1917. People ask why black on the outside and red on the inside. No one is really sure, it just seems that's the way it's always been done. One theory is that because snuff was black, a gentleman could open his box and see the level of snuff left against the red background, even if the light wasn't too great. After lacquering, the box is fired in a kiln for several days, the temperature increasing and decreasing daily to make sure the lacquer is sealed. Finally, some 30 months after the process started, the finished box is presented to the artist. Preliminary drawings will be ready and the artist will start to paint. Using brushes as small as 1 squirrel hair, the intricate detail of the boxes begins to emerge. The village of Fedoskino is unique. It is the only one of the 4 villages to use an extra medium, mother of pearl. Using oysters from the river Volga, the artist will carve into the papier-mâché in a style called intaglio, which is the opposite of how a cameo is carved. Into this carved area, a slice of mother of pearl is inserted. This is used to give extra dimension, be it sunlight through a window, reflection of the moon on water, or the shimmer of silk in a lady's dress. Slowly but surely the image will appear. The artist's work under 20 times magnification can only paint for a few hours at a time, so the process can take many months, sometimes years. These artists, just like their icon painting forefathers, lead an almost monastic lifestyle, devoting themselves uniquely to this true art form. Once the piece is painted, it will be signed by the artist. Traditionally, the artist signs in the bottom right-hand corner. In the left-hand corner is the village in which he works, and occasionally the piece will be titled, such as the name of a fairy tale or a specific building. In recent years, some artists have taken to signing the back or the inside of the box, but most keep to the time-honoured tradition. Any box without a signature is most definitely a fake. However, the artists do not embellish their work with huge egotistical signatures. They are mostly discreet and almost invisible without the use of a magnifying glass. The final touch is to add several layers of clear lacquer to seal the piece, and the whole box is polished to a mirror finish using a wolf's tooth, which is both extremely smooth and very hard. The artists who work in the villages have a reasonable amount of freedom when it comes to subject matter in the boxes. They are commercial artists, so will paint items they know are going to sell. With up to 2 years already invested in the manufacture and painting, it's important that each piece finds a buyer quickly. Old Russian tales are still very popular subjects with both Russian and foreign collectors. Here on the left we see Prince Igor, an 11th century tale of Russian victory in battle, made famous by Borodin's unfinished opera, which was completed by Rimsky-Korsakov. On the right we see Ruslan and Ludmila, a Russian retelling of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, published by Alexander Pushkin in 1820. As I mentioned earlier, prior to the Russian Revolution, only 5% of Russians were literate, and many of the old folk tales were verbally handed down. It was young Alexander Pushkin who undertook the task of recording many of these tales for posterity. He was a prolific author in his own right, but many of the tales attributed to him, such as Firebird, Magic Pike, Frog Princess, Snow Maiden or Zal Zoltan, are actually centuries-old folk tales which he simply committed to paper. When Pushkin was killed in a duel in 1837, aged just 38 years old, his work gained much popularity both domestically and internationally. And as a nonconformist member of the aristocracy, he became a folk hero with the common Russians. The lacquer artists seized on the interest, and as well as painting snuff boxes, they started to make larger boxes suitable for holding pens, spectacles, letters and such like, all featuring the work of Pushkin. Pushkin's tales are still painted today by the miniature artists, each village having their own distinct style. Here we see the Snow Maiden fairy tale. The piece from Fedoskino on the right uses oils and mother of pearl to create a three-dimensional image, whereas the piece on the left from Holy still follows the traditions of the icon painting forefathers by using the two-dimensional style and utilising tempera paints, which are made from ground down gemstones mixed with egg yolks and water. The last 100 years has been a turbulent time for the lacquer miniature artists and icon painters. Their heyday was the 19th century, but at the turn of the 20th century, the icon painters found themselves without work. Tsar Nicholas II had been deposed during the Russian Revolution of 1917, and Lenin had replaced religion with atheism, referring to it as the opium of the people. Icon painters and priests alike kept a low profile for many years, turning their art more towards lacquer miniatures, and the painting of Soviet-styled imagery became the norm, with depictions of farmers and workers, the Soviet military, and the joys of communism. One image which remained strong throughout Russian history, for many hundreds of years, through communism, and is still popular today, is that of Troika, the three horses of ancient Russia. Troika is the old Cyrillic word for the number 3, and Troika was used to signify the Holy Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as well as symbolising how the Russians saw their lives in 3 stages: youth, adulthood, and old age. Here again we see the differences between the villages. Fedoskino on the left in 3-dimension and oils, whereas the piece on the right is from Palek and again uses tempera paint to give a 2-dimensional traditional style. Also favoured as a subject matter during the years after World War II were anything promoting Russia, from Yuri Gagarin to Rudolf Nureyev, artists and writers to gymnasts and chess players. All were immortalised on these collectible lacquer miniatures. As you can see, the style of painting is also transforming over the years, with a far more modern approach to the subject matter. However, the art form was dying. Successive Russian leaders thought there was no place for these whimsical decorative arts, and by the 1980s, at the height of the Cold War, the art form was only being kept alive by a handful of faithful artists. The price of paint and lacquer was 10 times the price in the West. The carpenters who made the boxes now worked in the building trade, and most of the artists were employed elsewhere. Then, in the 1990s, the artists' fortunes were once again revived with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of communism in the Soviet Union, and the formation of the Russian Federation, along with the perestroika and glasnost that came with it. All of a sudden, lacquer, paint, and all the other raw materials were plentiful, and there was a new breed of younger foreign tourists clamouring to see what was behind the Iron Curtain. Cruise ship calls into St. Petersburg multiplied year on year, from 2 in 1990 to over 200 this year, and tourists arrived by air and road, all wanting a piece of Russia, and what better memory than an art form dating back over 1,000 years. The newly free Russian Federation also had a profound effect on the subject matter favoured by the artists. Sure, fairy tales and myths were still painted, but with access to TV and magazines, a whole new world of imagination was available to the artists. Prior to 1990, the only architectural images available were of Moscow or the surrounding villages. These were places that the artists had been to, so they were able to reproduce the miniatures. Now, scenes of St. Petersburg were for the first time appearing because the artists had been able to travel by train and see these magnificent structures for themselves. Here we see an image of Ivan's bell tower at the Kremlin, and on the right the famous Church of the Spilled Blood in St. Petersburg. With this new freedom, a whole new generation of artists has flourished, unshackled from the communist ideas of the last 80 years. Now we see far more elaborate and imaginative work, from copies of work by Gustav Klimt, here on the left his famous Kiss image, portrayed on a lacquer box, to the middle image by Knyazov is a tribute to the Lord of the Rings books by Tolkien. And on the right, a modern variation on the Snow Maiden by Oleg Shapkin. Oleg is one of a handful of artists, along with Sergei Kozlov, Zotov, Aldoshkina, Anokin, who still paint in their respective villages but now work from home and mentor young apprentice artists. These Grand Masters, as they are known, produce no more than 2 to 3 pieces per year, and their work can fetch in excess of $20,000 per piece. In each village, along with a handful of Grand Masters, there will be 10 to 15 master artists, and then possibly double that amount of apprentices. So currently there are less than 300 working artists creating these miniatures. This is down from a high of several thousand artists in the early 1990s. Unfortunately, the turbulent times for these artists are not over. Subscription to the apprentice programs is down 40% in the last 5 years, as talented artists become graphic designers or move to the city to seek their fortunes, like so many others in this new Russia. The monastic lifestyle, plus the very long apprenticeship, put many young artists off entering these schools, so once again the lacquer miniature industry is in crisis, with fewer and fewer artists producing work. This is pushing up the price of good quality work, but also opening the floodgates for huge quantities of fake or poor quality boxes now readily available in the shops and markets of Moscow and St. Petersburg. The result of this is that the villages are now concentrating on producing less work but of a much higher standard. Until a decade ago, a decent apprentice quality lacquer box would cost less than $100 or £60. Now you can pay over $600, £400. Master and Grandmaster work could be had for under $1,000, but these days are gone. So villages such as Holy and Palek are producing pieces such as these, pictured here. Very ornate, larger works, taking 18 months to 2 years just to paint, and selling for many thousands of dollars. Mystere has come to a point where they can only produce for private collections, and it's rare to see a piece of theirs on the open market. And this is the quality you will see on the markets in St. Petersburg. So, as the Romans used to say, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. The boxes you will see in St. Petersburg will fall into 3 different categories. Firstly, poor quality, mass-produced boxes, as you see here. Normally made of wood and then painted black, so no papier-mâché and no lacquer. Sometimes crudely painted, sometimes the image is a transfer. These are made for the tourist market either in China or in souvenir factories in Moscow, and they can't really be described as art. They are souvenirs. Secondly, out-and-out fakes. These may be lacquered and may be papier-mâché, but the image will be a transfer. Unlike the images above, the transfers can be of such good quality that even with a 10 times magnification, it's hard to tell. The forgers will even paint over the transfer in certain places to give the illusion that the whole piece is hand-painted. Very difficult to spot, and unfortunately there are unscrupulous traders who will charge the same price for an original as they will for a fake, worth a fraction of the price. Thirdly, original miniatures are credited and certified, which you will find in the galleries along Nevsky Prospect and in some of the 5-star hotels. Expect to pay roughly the same as you would pay on board the ship for these pieces, but bear in mind that once the ship has sailed from St. Petersburg, you will have no recourse if you have a problem with your purchase. How does a novice in this art form tell good from bad? Well, the most simple way is to inspect under magnification. Any reputable gallery will offer you a magnifier and instruction on how to use it. However, the best fakes these days use just the thinnest paper and print upwards of 3000 dpi, so you would require a 20 times magnifier or more to see the dot matrix which makes up the transfer. Just as when you stand too close to a TV you can see all the pixels which make up the image, so a box bearing a transfer you can see the dots rather than the original brushstrokes. Certification also offers peace of mind. Every lacquer miniature should come with a certificate of authenticity, stating the artist's name, village and subject matter, plus some way of contacting the seller in the event of a problem. However, as a general rule of thumb, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Our company has been buying and selling original lacquer miniatures for over 25 years. Our director visits the schools regularly and is personal friends with many of the artists. Every piece in our collection was hand-picked and checked by our company director and was purchased directly from the artist who painted it. As such, we can guarantee 100% provenance on every piece. We don't sell tourist quality boxes, we only sell lacquer miniature art. With prices increasing yearly and demand outstripping supply, these lacquer miniatures make the perfect memory of your cruise, and purchasing on board gives you both peace of mind and our expert knowledge in the field. I'd like to finish with this image. It's the most expensive lacquer box or lacquer boxes ever sold. Entitled The Well of Souls, it was painted in the late 1980s and sold for $20,000. This piece then turned up at auction in Geneva a few years ago and sold for over $250,000, excluding the buyer's premium. I hope you've enjoyed our journey through Russian art history. If you have any questions or would like to know more about our onboard collection of lacquer miniatures, please see our onboard Russian art specialist. Thank you.